Welcome to the coding challenge of this section. So we have built a couple of components together, and so now it's time for you to actually build this component here on your own. So basically this very simple pagination component that you see here on the right side. And this is what the final result should look and work like. So when we hover over these buttons here, they get this green background color, and the same here for each of the pages link. So here I want you to use two buttons, one to go to the previous and one to go to the next page. Then these in here are simply links, so anchor elements. And then we also have these dots here, which is a simple span text element. All right. Now, I don't want you to use any absolute positioning here or anything like that. So these buttons look the same or very similar to the ones that we used in the carousel component, but there we used some absolute positioning, which is not necessary in this case. So we don't have any visual container here. And so this one here is simply going to be the first element and this the last one. All right. Then notice how all of this here is vertically aligned and also how this entire pagination is centered in the browser. All right, and so I think that is enough for the instructions. So please go ahead and try to build this challenge now. And this is probably going to be the hardest challenge of all yet in this course. And so please don't be discouraged in case there is something that you cannot really do. So just try to do all that you can. So basically trying your best, because that's, as always, the most important thing. So pause the video now here and then come back for the solution once you're done. Okay, so how did that go? Hopefully you managed to do part of this pagination. And so now here comes the solution in case you missed anything. So let me, as always, get the starter code basically from this component file, then paste that here, collapse the sidebar, and I will now start here writing the HTML as always. Now here we want a div with the class of pagination, and of course we need to close that. And then we can immediately start with the first button element here, which will contain this icon. So you could have copied that from the carousel component, or also, of course, here from the hero icons. So that's what I'm doing now. All right. So this one, let's actually give it the class of button, and this one here, button icon. Then let's build our anchor elements. And I didn't mention that these shouldn't point anywhere, but hopefully you figured that one out on your own. So calling these one page links, but of course you could have called them whatever you liked. Okay. So copy pasting this a couple of times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the last one for page 23. 3, 4, 5, 6, and 23. Okay. And then also here between the 6 and the 23. So basically before the last one, we have some dots. So basically indicating that there are more than 6 pages and in total 23 pages. So that's a common thing to do in a pagination like this. And as I mentioned here, I'm going to use a span element with the class of just dots. And then here, well, the 3 dots. Okay, and let's now take a look here at what it looks like. So we need to reload this usually, and then here we go. So we have the button here, which is again very small, And we're missing actually the last button. So again, that's called btn. And then let's grab this icon here with the class of btn icon. Okay, and now I will copy all of these here, again with the trick of hitting Alt or Option at the same time. And I think that's it. So copying everything. And there we go. Now actually I'm going to do the same trick here again, because now I want to write the same thing in all of them. So we want to add a dot, then we can go all the way to the end, and then we can write this like this. All right, so we saved some time there, and let's now start styling them one by one here. And I will actually again start with the icon, because that's what makes these buttons here look so small right now. So we're giving them again a height and width of 24 pixels. So 24, and then of course the green color. So that's again using the stroke property. All right, so those are the icons. And remember that it's supposed to be this round with the green border around the button. So let's start with that actually. Border 1 pixel solid. Then let's give it some height and some width here as well. And let's make it double the one of the icons themselves. So 48 pixels. And then for the round corners, so basically to make it round, remember we use a border radius of 50%. All right, nice. Now we just need to get rid of the background color, which these buttons always have by default. And we also want to add that cursor, as always. Well, that didn't work. That's because here we actually need background, not just background color. Okay, now let's do the visual formatting of these individual links here. So that is page link. And then of course we need to add or pseudo classes, which are the link and the visited here first. And then remember also hover and visited, or actually hover and active. So let's start with the regular link styling. Let's make them a little bit bigger, 18 pixels, let's say. Then we also want the color to be our gray, so the one that we have always been using. And we want to get rid of the underlining. So that's text decoration none. And now as for the hover effect, let's again check out how that looks like. So basically there is this circle around each of the links, which then becomes green as we hover over it. Now what that means is that this circle actually needs to kind of exist already in the predefined link. So in the state before the hover, right? So let's actually do that. And as always, to make that work visually, let's give it some background color here first. And so now, of course, it's only a square. And if we hovered, or if we gave it some style now for the hover, then only that square would become green. And also the color white, since we're here already. So, right, now only the square that's around the actual element or behind the element would become green. And so we need to make that circle here at this point. So in order to do that, we give it a height and a width. So 36, which is one of the values that is in the spacing system, and the width of 36 as well. And so by this, we can ensure that it is an actual square. Now, right now, this didn't work yet, because remember that by default, this is an inline element, and so therefore it's not going to work. Inline block. And so now they are squares as expected. So to inline elements, height and width does not apply, right? And so we need to change that to something else. Great. So now we have this square that we can make round. And by the way, we couldn't use padding in order to create this new space, because by doing that, we could not ensure that they would be perfect squares. But by doing this, we can. Now, we also need to center the text now inside of the squares, both horizontally and vertically, right? So, once again, what is a nice trick to do that? Well, we can do that once again using Flexbox. And I think we did this trick before. So basically using Flexbox simply to center the text that is inside of an element, both horizontally and vertically. So here actually we do not want inline block as the display property, but flex, and then here align items, center, and also justify content center. All right, there we go. Now these links here suddenly got stacked, so they're now one below the other, and that's because basically by default a flex container is also something like a block element. So again, each of these page links here is now a flex container, right? And by default, flex containers are also like block elements. And so therefore, each of these elements now here occupies its own line. All right. So let's fix that in a moment. But in order not to jump around all the time, let's finish this part here first. So we still need to make them round. So that's border radius 50%. Right. And then we need to get rid, of course, of this background color. And so now that is actually the effect that we were going for, right? Okay. Actually, we also need the same effect here on these buttons, right? So we need to quickly implement that as well. So that is button hover. So background color this green. And now, of course, we also need to make the icon itself white. Like this, it is impossible to see, right? Now here, we need to do this. So let me write it first and then explain. So we are still interested in what happens when we hover the button here and not the button icon. And so what we want to happen is that the icon turns white when we hover the button. And so that's why we write button hover, like we did before, and then as a child of that condition, basically button icon selector. And so that is where the stroke then becomes white. All right, and so that works beautifully now. So if we didn't do this, so if we simply said, we copy this, because this is actually important. So if we did this, then it would work in a quite different way. So now if we hovered only the button, then the icon would still be green. But now as we move more inward, so at some point we will hover over the icon, right? And so now that is when the icon becomes white as we want it. But only, again, once we actually hover the icon itself. So that's what we said here, right? But again, that's not the effect we are looking for. Instead, we want the icon here to become white as soon as we actually hover the button itself. So just like this, right? Okay, so the visual styling here is almost complete. Now let's finally take care of the layout. So basically putting all of these elements here side by side. So that is the pagination class. And so as expected, for that we're going to use Flexbox. So it is a one-dimensional layout, so just a row, and so Flexbox is the right job for that. Beautiful. And now let's of course vertically align our items here. So align items, center. Okay. And now just to finish, we need some gap between them. And there we go. And of course, also we want to center this entire component here inside of the body as always. All right. Now here, you would have actually needed that trick that I showed you in the last lecture. So using basically Flexbox in order to center this component. That's because the trick with margin 0 auto will actually not work in this case. So that trick, remember, only works when we actually define a width on the element. So in this case, we would have to declare a width on the pagination and then use that trick of margin 0 auto. But in this case, we are not interested in actually giving this pagination a width. So the width is simply defined by basically all the width of this here added together. Right? So we're not defining it. And so therefore, that trick would not work. So instead, what we're going to do is to again make the body a flex container. And then justify content center. And by the way, this is not the kind of things that I expected you to also do in the coding challenge. So for the challenge, I was mainly interested that you did like this visual styling and all of that. But centering in the browser using this technique here, if you didn't do that, that's not a problem at all. Now let's just add some margin to the top here. All right, nice. So let's take a look at what's different. And so here, these dots, they need to have a different color. And then also there is basically this indication that we're on page number 3 right now. So basically an active page indicator. So let's style our dots, which are right here, right? And let's use some gray background color here. Let's say this. Not a background color, but an actual text color. Nice. And now, again, we want one of them here to look as if they were active right now. And so basically that style is exactly the same style as the hover, right? So we see that here, and it is exactly what happens when we hover. So since we already have that style written, which is this one here, we can simply reuse that. So let's add a class down here in the third one. So page link and then some sort of variation, which remember I like to use 2 dashes for that. So current. So this is the current page link. So let's copy that. And now we need to paste that right here. Okay, because once again, we already have written this style here, and so we can simply add this class to this list. And of course, we could have done it separately as well, but then we would have this code here in duplicate, and that's not what we want. However, actually, this is not going to work, and let me show you. Right? So it gave it the correct background color, but the text color itself is still coming from up here. And that's because right now, both these rules here are actually applying. So of course, this element is still a page link, So still this one here. And so that's where the text color comes from. But it is also a page link current. So that's where the background color comes from. So it uses this background color over this one here, which means that somehow this selector here gets priority over this one here. So this one. And the reason for that is a little bit complicated, but if we hover over it, you will see here that it says selector specificity 0 to 0, right? And down here, it says 0, 1, 0. And so that 2 here is higher, and so that's why this applies. And if you're interested in why this is 2, well, the quick reason is that here, this selector does actually have 2 classes or pseudo classes. So this is 1, and this is 2. And so that's why we have that 2, and here we only have 1. And so that's where this 1 comes from. However, we want this here to be applied always, right? So we want actually the color to be white as well. And so we need to make that the specificity is also 2 here. So what we can do is to use a new selector, which is basically the end selector. So let me write that here. And again, of course, this is not the kind of things that you could have figured out by yourself in the coding challenge, right? So basically, if we write this, but without the space here, that's very important, then that means that this only applies when the element has this selector and also this one. Okay? So again, this is the end selector, and it only applies to an element if it has both of these classes. So in this case, it does have page link and also page link current. Okay, and so very important, not the space. So with the space, it is a descendant selector, but without the space, it is an end selector. So again, end meaning that the element has both this class and this class. And so now the selector has 2 classes, and when we hover it, we see that 2 here. And so now both of them have 2, and so in that case, the one that is last is the one that applies. And so now you see that it turned white. All right, so this part, I admit, is a bit confusing. So maybe go back a little bit and listen to my explanation again, because this can be a source of confusion when you write your own code. And then in some situation, you might not really understand what is going on. Just remember that I showed you in one of the first sections the priority between these selectors. So between ID selectors and class selectors and element selectors. But there we didn't talk about this notion of specificity. And I still don't want to go deep into that. But I just want you to use basically VS Code here as a help. And so whenever you have one selector that has a lower value here in one of these points, then that is the one that will not get applied. So the one with the higher value is the one that gets applied. Okay, and again, now both here are at 2, so 0 to 0, and then it is the last of the 2 that gets applied. So if we change this here to the top, then it would still not work. So only now, because it is the last one, is the reason why it works. And I think with this, we actually finished this component. Yep, everything works nicely. And so that is it. So everything works nicely. And so our work is done here. So here is part 2 of the final web design lecture, which, remember, is about components and layouts. And in part 1, we talked about single elements and also components, right? And so now here in part 2, we are going to talk about bigger components, which I like to call section components, and also some layout patterns. But without further ado, let's get started with the section components. And we're going to start with navigation components. So in all these 4 examples, you have some navigation bar at the top of the page, And then when the user clicks or hovers over some of the menu items, then this submenu reveals itself. And here the submenu or secondary menu is just a small box basically that hovers over the rest of the page. So this is essentially the simplest way of having submenus on the page. And even simpler than this would to not have any submenu at all, which sometimes is also the right choice. So sometimes we just have a navigation bar with some links at the top of the page and without any submenu at all. But if we do need a submenu, which is usually when there are multiple subpages, like you see here in these examples, then we need a menu like this or an even bigger one. And so here are some examples of a kind of more complex submenu. So here we have a bigger box that gets popped out once the user hovers or clicks over one of the navigation items. So this is helpful when you have multiple subpages, or if you want to also include some more information maybe inside of the submenu. So this is essentially taking it one step further from what we had before. And then this one here is even the next step, which is basically having one panel that reveals itself and which occupies the entire width of the page. So these are useful when we have even more links to display or when we want to describe different pages of our website beforehand. So here in this bottom example, these different parts of the website are nicely being described by a short sentence. So this is actually a very nice feature that is becoming quite modern, so that you will see on many websites that you visit these days. And so here are some more examples of that. And again, you see how all of them give a short description about these different pages that the user is about to visit. So it's kind of a small summary of maybe the subproducts that the website has. Then here we have some more examples. Here, the one in the bottom of IBM has kind of a sidebar also in the navigation. The one in the top has some very nice images. And again, these are actually part of the navigation, just like also on the Apple side, which uses these icons. So actually kind of these product images close to the links themselves. All right. Then here are some more creative uses of navigations where we have some overlays. So these two on the right side especially. So this is a navigation pattern that's used on mobile screens where the entire navigation overlays the rest of the page, but it might also be used on the desktop version of these pages because this simply provides a nice effect in some cases. Then in the bottom, I also have some simpler navigations, and these are usually used in some kind of web application. Then here, finally, we have some examples of secondary navigations. And a secondary navigation is basically just a second navigation bar that shows the user all the other pages that are inside of the current main navigation item. Like in this Blue Wave example here, we are currently in the Community Solar menu item, which has two sub-pages. And so those are project services and sales partners. And so they are nicely displayed here in this secondary navigation for the user to be able to basically navigate this secondary menu item. So these can be helpful again if you have a big website with a lot of different pages. Okay, but now let's actually move on to our hero sections. And the hero section is basically the very first section of the page, which contains like a description of the site in the main heading, and many times it also has some buttons and some images. And right now for the hero section, there are three big trends. The first one is to have text on one side and the image on another side. Then the second one is to have a background image with some text on top. And the third one is to first have some text and then below that some image. And so let's start with the first example. So having the text on one side and then an image on another one. So this is, I would say, the most common hero section that we see these days. So again, some buttons, some headlines, and many times there's also some text description of the product or the service. So here are some more examples of that. And again, I'm including many different examples here because I know that this is going to be really helpful when you need to choose some design for your own hero section one day. So here are even more, and actually even more right here. So this is the first type of hero section. So again, image on one side, text on the other side. And now let's go to the second type. So having a background image and then some text on top. Now this type of hero section used to be extremely popular like 5 years ago, but now it's getting a little bit out of favor and is replaced by the category that we just saw. So here I just have 4 examples, and now here is the other one. So where first we have some text and maybe a button, and they're all nicely centered, and then below that usually we have some kind of image. So that's exactly what you see here in all these 4. And here are 4 more examples of that. And again, hopefully you like one of them for your next design. Then here we have some hybrids, so mixing multiple of the styles that I mentioned before. So that's of course also possible. Next up, let's talk about the pages footers. And again, we can do them in many different ways, but right now it's kind of a trend, and actually it's become a standard even, I would say, to include a complete sitemap of your website right here in the footer. So that's exactly what we have in all these examples right here. Now, if your website is very big with a lot of different pages, then maybe it doesn't make sense to have like an entire sitemap, but at least usually some secondary or even tertiary links are usually found in the footer. So some information about the company or some privacy policies or simply some other information of the company or website. It's also very common to have the social icons in the footer, so the links that will point to the different social media profiles of the company. And sometimes there's also some kind of submit form, like to sign up for some newsletter or something like that. Then here are some more examples, some a little bit more complex or more creative. Now in the bottom here, we actually also have some way more simpler footers. So not always you need to go with a fully fledged footer like the ones we just saw. For example, the Tesla website, which is this very last one here, simply has these 7 or 8 links, and that's it. So that's also an okay choice if you want to go with a more minimalistic approach. Next up, let's talk about call to action sections. And these are some kind of section that we have close to the end of our page, where after presenting all the information that we wanted to show on the page, we then want the user to take some kind of action. So maybe subscribing to a newsletter or trying out a free trial or simply contacting the company. And for these sections, it's quite common to have them stand out from the rest of the elements of the page by using some sort of visual hierarchy, like using a different color or using some background image. So when you build some kind of marketing page, then usually you will want to have some kind of call to action section by the end of the page. So here are some more examples that you can use if you'd like. Then here are 4 more. And this one here, I included them because all of them use the process of social proof once again by the end of the page. So the 2 examples at the top use some customer logos to show again that their product is actually used. And so that adds a lot of social proof. And then the 2 examples at the bottom, they simply reinforce some of the most important product features, like saying that it is just a one-time purchase or reassuring the user that there is a 30-day money-back guarantee. So again, these can be very important to push the user over the edge in order to basically have them spend their money. Then these 4 examples here, they simply ask the user to contact them, which is something that is very useful if the site is not for some kind of service that the user can sign up for. So these 4 call to action sections, they simply ask the user to contact them. And that can also be a very valid way of having the user take some action by the end of the page. So you can provide some email address or some telephone number or simply a link to a contact form. But whatever your website and your industry is about, always make sure to have some call to action section like this one. Now finally, our last section components are the feature rows. So feature rows are small sections of the page which usually describe some feature of the product or service. And usually multiple of these rows are then combined using some kind of pattern, as we will see in a minute. But anyway, a feature row like this is usually quite simple. So normally there is some kind of image on one side, and then there is some text on the other side. And this text is usually some small heading, and then some description, and also sometimes maybe a button that leads to a page that explains that feature a little bit better. And so that's what we can actually see on all of these 4 feature rows, right? So always an image, then some text, and 3 of them actually do have a button. Then here, let's take a look at some more. And I'm sure you have seen these type of feature rows all the time when you browse, well, most type of websites. So take some inspiration from these. And here are some more. And in 3 of these examples, we actually have a testimonial right here in the feature row. So one testimonial that is related to the feature that is being displayed in this row. And this can be a very powerful way of selling the product or service. And so more and more websites are starting to do this. So definitely something that you can try out once you build your own websites. Then here are some more for your inspiration. And what these have in common, or at least 3 of them, is that they use a small uppercase title just before the main heading. And so this is another trend that we are starting to see more and more. And I think I actually explained this somewhere else already a little bit. All right, so these are the 5 big section components that I identified and that I'm sure you will start seeing now everywhere once you start browsing the web with this knowledge. And so now let's actually move on to patterns. But what actually is a layout pattern? Well, a layout pattern is simply a specific way of repeating a certain component multiple times. And the most simple layout pattern is probably the simple row of boxes or row of cards. So previously in our component gallery, we actually saw some of them before, but individually. But here we have them repeated in a row. And so this is a very, very common pattern. So having a couple of boxes or a couple of cards like these, all in a row. And so we have seen many examples of this before. And so here we don't need a ton of examples. And so let's go on straight to our second layout pattern, which is actually pretty similar. So here, instead of a row of boxes and cards, we have a 2-dimensional grid. And so again, this is extremely common, especially in something like online shops. But also in displaying features on a website, we will see this pattern all the time. And here are some more examples. Now, as an aside, we can actually also nest patterns inside of components. Now, inside of each of these components, we actually have one of the 2 patterns that we just studied. So 3 of these examples have a grid of cards pattern, and the other one is a row of cards pattern. So what this means is that we can mix and match all of these patterns and components as we would like. So patterns can contain components, which can in turn also contain some more patterns inside of them. So just keep that in mind when you design on your own. Next up, we have the Z pattern. And so this one here is a combination of different feature rows. So basically the Z pattern is a way of repeating similar feature rows, but with alternating configurations. So here in this first example, we first have the image on the left side, then in the next feature row, we have it on the right side, and then in the next feature row, we have it again on the left side. And so this will then create this kind of Z pattern for our eyes. So we start on the left side, then the eye goes to that content, then to the next content, then to the image, and so on and so forth. Now the reason why this pattern is so extremely popular is that our eyes have a tendency for scanning opposing rows like we have here. And so now that you know about this pattern, you will see it absolutely everywhere once you browse the web. And here are some examples, and most of the time 3 rows are used. So just like in the previous examples and like here in this first example, but of course it can also be more than 3 rows or just 2 rows. So that's completely normal and possible as well. Now next up we have the F pattern, which can also be about repeating feature rows, but the repetition can also be about something like more horizontal cards, like we actually have here in the first example. Now the main difference between the F and the Z pattern is that the configuration of the rows does not alternate. So in the first and second example, we always have the image on the left side and the content on the right, while on the right side, we basically have the inverted F pattern. So we have the images on the right and then the content on the left. So basically we draw the main axis here where the images are because they draw the most attention, and then from there we go to the content. So that's why I mentioned that the last one is the inverted F pattern. And here there are 3 more examples where actually all of them are the inverted F pattern, but usually we can simply call them F pattern anyway. But what matters here is that basically the images are all on one side and then the text content is on the other ones. So no alternating configurations in this one. All right, now next up we have the single column pattern. Now this one is mostly used on responsive websites on mobile phones, or also on just very simple websites like these 3 ones that we have here. Also, this layout can be used on simple blog posts where we don't want any sidebars for distraction. And speaking of sidebars, that actually brings me to our next pattern, which is exactly the sidebar pattern. So the sidebar can be used for blocks, as I just mentioned, or they can be used for options in a web application or as a table of contents, or also as a summary. So here we have examples of all of those. And here then in the next slide, we have some examples of web applications, where we then have a sidebar where all the different options are located. Now we're almost finishing here. Next up, we have the multi-column or magazine layout. So this one is basically about combining different columns with different width into some kind of layout that I'm sure we're all familiar with. So basically to create some kind of more traditional magazine layout like these. And finally, we also have these more experimental or asymmetric layouts. So here we can use all our creativity in order to create some standout designs. So all of these are quite uncommon, but they will allow us to give our design some kind of different impact to our users. And by the way, many of these experimental layouts were actually made possible by CSS Grid. So for example here, the first and second examples, they are clearly like very gritty, right? And some years ago, this was almost impossible to build. And so we didn't see layouts like these a couple of years ago. But now more and more, we start seeing designs like these popping up. And that's also because many designers are getting a little bit tired of designing always the same kinds of layouts that we see all over again. And so that's why there has been a small trend, at least, towards these more experimental layouts. So here are some more, and I think all of them are quite nice. And actually, not your entire page needs to have this more experimental layout. So these first 3 examples that we have here are actually just a small section of each of their websites. And so you can, of course, also do that. So basically just including something like a small grid like this, because that alone might give your design a special impact. Okay, and that's all I had to show you for layout patterns. So I hope that you find this as interesting as I did. So I really took a lot of time compiling these and researching all of these different layouts and components as well, because this stuff really fascinates and interests me. So hopefully I was able to spark some of that interest in you as well, because that was actually one of my main goals with all these design lectures. And with this, we do actually finish our web design lectures. So again, I hope you had a lot of fun with those, but this section is actually not finished yet. So we will now build 2 components, one hero section and one web application layout. So I hope to see you there soon so that we can get back to code here. Hey there, and welcome back to writing some more code. And this lecture is going to be really exciting, because in this and the next one, we will build a beautiful hero section and learn a ton of new CSS along the way. So let's get started. And this is the hero section that we're going to build in this lecture. And it actually has the content of the 𝗦𝗬𝗜𝗖𝗬 project that we will start very soon. So this heading here and this description and this button are exactly the ones that we will find also in our 𝗦𝗬𝗜𝗖𝗬 section, or actually our 𝗦𝗬𝗜𝗖𝗬 project. So you see here this beautiful background image which spans all across this viewport. So it has exactly the height and the width of the viewport. So if we change this here, you can see the image changing, right? And we can even, of course, change the entire window. And notice how the text always stays centered. So basically, this entire block here, it always stays centered vertically. So even in the extreme case, going over that navigation. So basically this bar here. So this logo and the navigation, of course, don't look real, but we will do that in our 𝗦𝗬𝗜𝗖𝗬 project. Now I'm only interested here basically in the rest of the hero section. So having this background image and having then this nice block of text here, and all basically filling the entire browser, and especially filling here the entire height. So I think that this is an exciting small project, and so let's get started now. And since we now actually need the entire size of the browser, let me actually put this here on another desktop on the Mac. And if you're on Windows, you can just keep switching between the windows. Let's make this one here big and also create here a new component. So the hero.html. And this one we will actually not copy from the other component because there are some major differences. But we will also scaffold very easily our HTML. So again, just write the exclamation mark and then hit tab, and there is our HTML. Let's just say this is the 𝗦𝗬𝗜𝗖𝗬 hero section. Okay. Then here inside of the head, we will also have the style so that we don't need 2 different files. And now here in the body, let's create our hero section. And for that, we will use the header element. All right. So remember that the header element is the semantic element for basically the introduction of the website. And so that is essentially what this is. Also, I didn't show you that then below this, we have some other section with just some random text, just so we can exactly see that this header has exactly the height of the viewport. And so that will then simply be a section element, which remember is exactly that. So just a section of the page. So then here inside of the header, we will have a nav element. And then here we would typically include some logo and some actual navigation links. But here I will simply add some div, which then says logo, and another div, which says navigation. Okay, so that is that first box. And now here is basically that big box, which will contain all of the content. And notice how I'm not using any class names here. So I want to do that a bit later as we start writing the CSS together. So basically, so I can explain you how we built a thing like this step by step, completely from scratch, without assuming any of the class names in the beginning. But anyway, let's now write our actual content here. So a healthy meal delivered to your door every single day. Next, there is some paragraph, and you can just write some blind text here if you want. But in this case, in the very beginning, I like to actually have some actual content. So to make it a little bit more real looking. So the 360 days per year food subscription that will make you eat healthy again. Tailored to your personal tastes and nutritional needs. Okay, and then we have some kind of button there, but that button is actually a link because it leads somewhere. But let's of course give it an empty href, just like usually. And here we can actually already put our class, which is as usual button. So start eating well. Okay, and for now that is it. And now inside of the section, we will want to then center the entire content here. So let's give ourselves another box. And then in there, some h2 element, for example. So some, I don't know, random handy heading. And then some paragraph. And here we can now use lorem, maybe even twice. Okay, so let's take a look at our result for now. So once again, we need to now go back or just remove this part here. And here it is, the hero. And so indeed, our content here without any styling whatsoever. And so let's actually start with that styling. And I will now select another font from Google Font. And the one that we are going for is called Rubic. And I will explain more about why this is the choice of our typeface when we actually build the project in the next section. So 4, maybe 5 and 700. Okay. So as always, just select these different styles of different font weights, basically. And then here is that summary. So we selected regular, medium, and bold. And then all we have to do is to copy this link that we now need to include in our HTML at the very top. So it needs to be before our own style. Let's actually put that here. Okay. And now in our HTML, we can say font family, and then we set it to Rubic. And then if that is somehow not available, as a second option, we then want just the predefined sans serif typeface. Okay. And as the text color, let's just use some gray here, 444. Okay. So that should look, a little bit better already. Okay. And now let's just create basically the visual styling here. So make this text a little bit bigger and also put them side by side. And of course, styling all of this text here, including this button. Okay. So starting with the navigation, let's set a font size of 20 pixels and make it bold as well. And actually, let's select the actual number 700 that we loaded here, right? So these are the actual font weights. And then to put them side by side, of course, we use display, set to flex. And then the trick to push each of them to one of the sides, remember, is justify content to space between. Okay. Beautiful. So there we go. That looks great. And now let's work with our H1. So let's make it quite big at 52 pixels. And this is actually, once again, one of the values of our type scale. So we can look that up somewhere here, for example. And so here is that 52. And again, I'm not going to choose now multiple to show you how it works, because that will take up too much time. All right. Then just some margin on the bottom, let's say 32 pixels. And then let's also style this paragraph. And this will then also style that one, which is not really relevant anyway. So font size of 20 pixels. So you see that usually I start with these visual text styles. Let's also add some line height of 1.6. And then some margin to the bottom, because remember that afterwards comes the button. All right. So let's take a quick look at what we have. Great. That looks very nice. And now again, making this button look like this. So with these slightly rounded corners and this beautiful orange color. So that is called the button. And as always, we need to style the visited state and actually first even the link state. So always in this order. So let's give it a font size of 20 pixels. A font weight, we selected 600 as well. Actually, we did not. So instead of 500, let's actually select 600. So to make it bold, but not quite as bold, because that looks strange a little bit. So 600 is just nice for buttons usually. Then that background color. And here I'm just going to give you the hexadecimal code. So 𝗬67𝗬22. All right. And the color then, of course, needs to be white. Otherwise, we're not going to see anything. Oh, and we also need to get rid of the underline. So text decoration, none. So part of the button should be done now. All right. But now, of course, we need some spacing around it and the rounded corners. So for that, we need some padding. And if we want to apply padding, then we should make this an inline block and not just an inline element as it is by default. So inline block. And so this is hopefully starting to get routine at this point. So 16 pixels. And as usual, I like to give left and right the double as top and bottom. So this one is the value on top and bottom, and this on left and right side. Remember? And so now border radius, and here let's say 9 pixels. And there we go. So that looks very beautiful. And so all that we need to style is this H2 here, and maybe add some padding to this entire section as well. So H2, _44 pixels, which I think is the value below 52, right? and some margin to the bottom of 48 pixels. All right, and finally add some padding to the section. So 96 top and bottom, and the sides don't need any padding at all. Okay, and I'm doing this all quite fast, but once we actually start designing and building the 𝗦𝗤𝗜𝗖𝗬 project in the next section, then I will go over these design decisions a little bit better. But anyway, let's now compare this a little bit to this one here. And the first thing that we notice immediately is that all of these boxes are kind of centered. So this one here, and all of this here, and also, in a way, this box here. I mean, it doesn't really look centered. It looks more like it's aligned here. But still, if we change the width here, then you see that still it kind of is centered. So that's what I mean with centered. And so let's now create a class which will take care of only doing that. So we could, of course, add now the styling of this. So margin, 0 and auto, right? But then we would have to add that to every single element. So every single box that we want centered in the browser. But we don't want to do that. So for that, we can create something like a utility class, and then simply add that class to all the elements that we do want centered. So let's add that here, and I'm going to call it container. So that's a pretty common name. And then I'm adding that property here. And so now in our HTML, we can add that class here. And here. And also to this div here inside of the section. All right. So now this section here itself is not centered, but then this div is centered inside of it. And this, again, is a pretty normal technique. Now, we could have centered the entire section here and also the entire header, but we actually do want these to go from side to side of the viewport. In this case of the header, because we later want to give it a background image, and, well, in case of the section, because imagine that it had some background color, for example. Now, actually, there is one thing missing here, because remember that we always need to specify a fixed width for the container. So for the element on which we use this trick. So let's say that we want all of these here to be 1200 pixels wide. And so now they will indeed be centered. And there we go. Let's see. Yeah, that works just nice. And now, as I was saying, with the background colors and the background images, let's actually now add some colors so that we can see what I just mentioned. So to the nav, let's add a background color green. Then let's see what else we have here. Well, the container, we actually don't want to give it a background color because then all of them would get the same one. And so for now, let's just add one here to this section. And here let's add this very light gray that I like to use, which is F7, F7, F7. Right? And actually let's shortly add a color to the container. Red. Okay. And so now here is what I meant. So that we have now this content here centered and not the entire section. Because to the section, we do actually want to apply this background image. And if we centered the entire section, well, then we couldn't give it any background color around it. So not some background color that would go all the way from the left to the right. Now I see that we do have some margins here, like on the sides of the page. And that's because we didn't do our general reset here. So I forgot that somehow, but this is something that we must always do. So by default, setting all margins and all paddings to 0, and also use the alternative box model. So by using box sizing set to border box. Great, so that's better. And so now let's actually do that thing where we make the header the entire height of the viewport. So all of this, because that's actually not very hard. And so we can do that right away. Now the navigation here somehow is not green. But sure, that's because we gave all the containers the red color. So let's remove that. Right. And let's now add some styles to the header element. So to start, let's just make it green or some other background color. Let's say orange red. So before we make it 100% tall. Okay. So that's what it looks like now. But now it's time to do what I just mentioned. So we want to set the height of it, but now we can actually not set 100%. So we cannot do this because this will simply not work. Instead, what we need to do is to use a new unit that we have never talked about. And that unit is called viewport height. So VH. And that's actually it. So basically, this will be 100% of the available viewport. So if we give it a save, well, then that's exactly what happened. So it's now 100% of the viewport. So it ends exactly down here. And if we shrink this, then, well, the height keeps being at 100% of the available viewport right now. All right, so this is a trick that we use all the time. So VH, which means viewport height. And of course, it could be any other value here. Let's say 50. And then it would be exactly half of the viewport. And of course, it could be even more, like 150. Then it would be essentially 1.5 of the viewports. Right? But usually we don't do that. We just leave it at 100 or some lower value. Now there's also another similar unit, which is VW, which stands for viewport width. However, we don't need to use that here. And in fact, we very rarely use that one, because since these are all block elements, they will already occupy 100% of the available space by default, right? So no need for that. All we need to specify is the height. Okay, so this was actually the first part of the video. So we managed to do these basic things, some basic styling and some very basic layout. And so let's take a small break here. And then when we come back, we will actually center this entire box here vertically, and we will add that beautiful background image. So I see you back here after a small break. And let's keep working and actually finish our hero section. And this is where we left off. And what we want to do now is to vertically center this box, which has all of this content, right? But at the same time, keeping this navigation bar here at the very top. So let's explore different ways of actually doing that. And probably the first thing that comes to mind would be Flexbox, right? So let's try out if that would be a good fit. So basically applying Flexbox here on the entire header. So let's see. Display, flex, and then in order to vertically center, align items and center. So let's see. But that would of course first put these two elements side by side and then vertically center them. So it looks nice on this one here, but it does not look good on the navigation bar, because we actually want this one to stay at the very top. And so Flexbox is probably not the best way here to go. Now, in order to solve this, there are actually multiple ways. So there are multiple ways in which we can achieve this layout, so this design here that we want. But the one that we're going to use is to basically vertically center this box here using that trick that I showed you earlier with absolute positioning and then using the transform function with translate. So remember that? So I actually showed you a diagram back then. And so now let's do the same thing here. So this one we don't need. And instead, what we now want is to center this element here. So this container. And so actually we need to give this here a different class name. So this should now be different because of course it's absolutely centered. And so the styles that we need are different than the ones from the container. So let's call this one here the header container. Copy this. And after the navigation, which is how it looks like in the code. And we still want the width to be 1200 pixels. So that is the same. But now remember, we want to position it absolutely. Position absolute. And let's start here by putting it at left 50% and right 50%. Because remember that we actually want to center this element, right? And so 50% is kind of the middle. But of course, we then will need to use the transform function as well. But for now, let's take a look at what it looks like this. And so let's even give us some background color here again. And let's say violet. All right. So it did move already 50% here of the parent element to the right, but not to the bottom. And I think that is because we forgot to actually set the relatively positioned container. So we want this element here to be absolutely positioned inside of the header, right? And so never forget to then set the position to relative on that one. So, well, actually here we also have a mistake. So of course it needs to be 50% from the left and from the top, not from the right. That would not work. No, right? So basically at this point here, it is now 50% from the top and from the right. And remember that these 50% are in relation to the parent element. So it's 50% of this parent element here to the bottom, and also 50% of this parent element's width here to the right. Okay? And so now we need to fix that by basically moving it up a little bit back so that it's actually in the middle. So I hope you remember this technique. And if not, you can always go back and look at that slide with that visual explanation that I showed you. But what we will do now is to use the transform property with the translate function. And then we will move it back up 50% of the element's width and of the element's height. So minus 50 in both cases right here. And again, I will write it down here that these are in relation to the element size, while these two are in relation to the parent size. And so that is the reason why this works and why it looks beautifully like this now. So if we change this, well, at least up to these 1200 pixels, then it stays nicely in the center. And actually it will stay in the center forever. And of course, also the same vertically. So you see, it always really stays in the top, even if it has to overlap this navigation bar here and this extreme situation. Okay, so this is exactly what we wanted. So that's amazing. And now comparing it to this one here, you see that here actually the text kind of finishes here, like it looks like in the middle of the page, right? So that maybe looks like it's a little bit difficult to achieve, but actually it's very easy. So basically what we want is to simply have another container here. And so that element will then simply occupy 50% of the width. And so that will then contain these elements, right? And so by doing that, we basically leave some space here for her face and for this part here of the background image. And then we have this text here beautifully on top of this blurred part. So that's why I chose to put the text and all this content here really on the left side. Okay. Of course, there could be other design decisions. So I also showed you that we could actually center the text, which is what some websites do. And just as an aside, this would be very easy. All we would have to do is on the container element. So the container element of those text elements, here we would simply have to do text align center. And so this would work quite nice if the image was different. So basically, if the focus point of the image was down here in the bottom, for example, then this would work perfectly. But that's not the case. So let's comment that out. And then, as I was saying, we will simply create another element right here. So let's call this the header container inner. Okay, then moving that down. So header container inner, let's put it right here. And as I was saying, all we have to do is give this one a width of 50%, which is again in relation to the parent element. So it will essentially be 600 pixels, so half of 1200, but let's start to get used to using percentages for this kind of thing. Now just some background color very quickly, just for debugging, and there we go. So the contrast here is quite bad, but we can see that actually this worked. So now this is the container for the text, which occupies exactly 50% of this bigger container. All right. And so in the end, achieving a layout like this is all about thinking about these boxes and how we want them to be laid out and to be displayed in our website, right? So really, it's all just a matter of logically thinking about these boxes and to push them around until in the end, they are exactly where we want them to be. Now let's just remove some of the line height here in this heading. Looks a little bit off. Let's use something really small, 1.05. And finally, let's get rid of all of these background colors so that now we can finally add our beautiful background image there. So let's see. And there we go. Beautiful. So this is what we're looking for. So all we're missing is this background color, and then of course setting this text to white, but that is very easy. So that background image should be the background of this entire header element, right? And so this is where we can now define, for the first time ever, the background image property. And now to specify the image, we need to write URL and then open and close parentheses. And then here we need to specify the path of the image in relation to our current file. And so in this case, that is simply hero. So just right here, hero.jpg. And we don't even need any quotes here around this image path. So all we need is to add this and we're good. And you already see the image being loaded up here in the gutter, which means that this path is correct. So we will have this background image now already, but it will not look as expected, as you see. So this image is in fact huge, and so therefore we only can see a small part of that image right now. Right? So these lights that we see here are basically, well, it's just this small part here of the website somehow. Right? And so therefore, we now need some way of shrinking that image down. But fortunately for us, there is a nice and handy property, which is called the background size. And here there are a couple of different options, and mainly those are contain and cover. But I usually, and I think everyone, most of the times just uses cover. And what this value of cover here will do is to figure out automatically the exact size that the image needs to be to cover, as the name says here, the entire element. And so now, as we check this out, it looks a lot better. And so as we resize, you will see that always the image covers the element, no matter what we do. All right. So this looks great already, but there is still a crucial difference here. And that difference is that here we actually have this dark overlay over this image, right? So remember from one of our web design sections that when our image is too light, in order to actually make the text readable, we can, as one of the options, make the image a little bit darker. And so that's what this darker overlay here is all about. So of course right now our text is even still gray. So let's make it white here in the first place, so we can actually see what we need to do. So just like this. And I mean, technically we could read it, right? But still it looks kind of off. There is not enough contrast here right now between this text and this image. So it's quite confusing. And so we need to darken down that image. Now doing that is not really trivial. So it is a bit harder than it might seem. So you might have thought that there was some simple property that would simply do that, but in fact there is not. Instead, what we need to do is to basically create a stack of background images where the first background image is a gradient that is transparent. So that sounded a little bit confusing, so let me actually show you how it works. And actually to do this, let's create a gradient somewhere else just so you see how the syntax works. So to create a gradient, we still use the background image. And then we use the linear gradient function like this. So linear-gradient, and then we can specify two colors. So let's say red and blue. Okay, just to test a very simple gradient. And so you see, now we do have this gradient going from red to blue. Okay, so that's the very basic syntax of the linear gradient. And we can do some more stuff like changing the direction. For example, we can say to right. So as a first option here, I think this is how it works at least. And yeah, so now it goes from red to blue, from left to right. Okay, but anyway, we will explore gradients a little bit more in the next section, but I just wanted to show you how they work. And that's important because, as I said, we actually need a linear gradient to make a background image darker. So this is kind of a strange trick, so let me show it to you. So here in the same background image, we will now specify a linear gradient, and then with a comma, we basically specify a second image. So this is kind of a stack where this background image here, which is this gradient, is on top of this one. And we could, in fact, specify many different background images even, not just one or two. So again, this will create a stack where this one is on top and this one here is on the bottom. But now, what colors are we actually going to use? Well, we want to make the image darker, right? And so let's start with black. So 0, 0, 0. And then the other value, let's make it also black. So that is the trick here. So it is to make both colors here the same. But of course we don't want absolute black, because then we would get this, okay? So we want some opacity here, so some RGBA. So let's do that by clicking here on the title again. And so we already had it actually. So let's put this here like to 0, 6. And then let's do the same here for the second color. And now we should actually get a usable result. Well, not quite actually. Let's go back here. That's because I did not delete the hash here. But here we go. So that's beautiful, right? And yeah, it is the same color here all over the image. Again, because we made the gradient go from one color to the second one, which are both exactly the same. But of course, it wouldn't have to be that way. We can specify some other, let's say just some random colors here, just to see that in this case, of course, we could go from black to this kind of blue color here, right? But of course, we don't want that. We want them to be the same, but let's just use some kind of gray here, which looks a little bit better than just pure black usually. But again, that is a design decision that you have to take. So of course you can use pure black, but I think using some shade of gray here looks a little bit better. So it gives us this kind of softer touch here. And so I think now we actually have the exact same design as in our final result. There's just some spacing here going on. So let's add that. So that's in the navigation. So here, and let me actually show you how to not do it. So let's say margin top 32 pixels. So why do you think that is not going to work as intended? And well, nothing happened here. Let's inspect why that is. So here we have our margin top of 32 pixels, but it is actually crossed out. And that's because here from the container, we get margin top and bottom of 0. And so remember our priorities. So a class selector has more priority than a simple element selector. And so that's why this one here overrides this one. But here in the developer tools, we can actually also set styles right here. And so here, this element style will basically set them right here as inline styles. And so remember that those have an even higher priority. So just to experiment, so margin top 32 pixels. So you see now it's set that here and is now overwriting that 0. Now I mentioned that I wanted to show you why this doesn't work. And the reason is that now this actually will create an empty space outside of the box, right? And so that will then therefore create this white space here on top. So that's obviously not what we want. So we want to go with padding instead. So let's see. And there we go. And with that, we actually finished this header component. So a lot of new CSS we learned here. And in particular, we learned how to set this background image here. We learned about the background size. And also we learned about this new VH unit. And also, and probably even more importantly, we kept thinking about how to achieve the layouts that we wanted using the code tools that we have at this point. So teaching you that is probably my most important goal here, because looking up properties is very simple, but learning how to think about how to create a layout exactly like this with all the properties that we would like it to have is not so easy to look up on the web. And so I hope that with all these exercises and all these small projects, you are starting to get better and better at that. But anyway, that wraps up this small mini project. And so now there's only one more component or one more layout to build in this section. And so I hope to see you there soon. To finish this section, let's now build a typical web application layout. And this is going to be a great learning project. So let's get started. And so here is the layout that we're going to build throughout this lecture and the next one. So it's not very styled and it's not very detailed, but what matters here is the layout itself. So basically we have some site navigation bar here. So this would be for things like the image and maybe some profile menu or things like that. Then here in the top we have a menu bar. So basically for actions for this application. And what we're making here is basically a fake email application. And so these menu items here are related to emails. So new email, reply, forward, mark as unread. And then also all the way here to the right side in red, this trash button. Then here we have this section where we have different emails. So where we can see all the emails in some inbox. And then notice how we can actually scroll here. So that's a really nice feature and it's actually very easy to do. Then here in the middle, this is kind of the main part of the fake application. And then also here is like this sidebar, which has some additional information on this email. And this whole application layout is of course exactly the height and the size of this viewport here. All right, so this looks like fun, I hope. And so let's now actually get started. So let's just review the main elements that we need are this navigation here, then this menu bar, then we have this section right here, then this one, and then this one. All right. So let's give ourselves yet another new file here. So 06 app layout.html. And we will again start from scratch here. So exclamation mark and then tab or enter. And then let's get started. And our HTML here is actually very simple. So we have a nav element. And here I'm simply going to write nav actually. Let's use lowercase. Then after that, we have that menu bar. And so here is a new HTML element, which is exactly called menu. So what's the difference between nav and menu, you might ask? Well, the nav element is for a typical navigation of a site. So navigation which contains a bunch of links, which then points to other places in the application. Menu here, on the other hand, is actually for like menu buttons in an actual web application. So we use nav all the time, so it's a very commonly used element, but menu not so much. It's only used when we build a web application. But that's the case right here, and so now we need this element. Here for now I'm just writing menu. Then here for this inbox view, I'm going to use a section element. Then for the main email view, I will use the main element, because this one, remember, is really used to display the main piece of content of the document. So the most important one. And so in this case, that is basically the email itself. Then that additional information is exactly the main use case for the aside element. So additional info. And for now, that's actually it. These are the 4 parts, or actually 5 parts, of our application layout. So give it a save, and then let's go back here, removing this part here, and then here is the app layout, and there we go. So you see that actually for the menu, HTML automatically applies some default margin or padding here, but that's not a problem because of course we're gonna get rid of all of that right now. So again, doing everything in the same file here. Let's start with our global reset, margin 0 and padding 0, and of course box sizing border box. Nice. Then let's start with some visual styles as always. Now in this case, I'm actually not going to include any third-party font and instead just go with this one. Now the color, well, let's actually use the one from before. Or this one here. And let's also give everything a nice font size of 24 pixels. Okay, and now let's just style our different pieces here with some background color as always, because that always makes it a lot easier to see what is actually going on. So this navigation bar had this color, then the menu has that nice violet color, and let's actually get that from open colors again. So violet is one of these colors that I really like for UI design. And well, this one here looks nice. I think that's the one I am using. Then of course the color needs to be white in this one. And then also the aside and the section have some different background colors. So background color, and let's go get that gray color again. So I think this is the one that we have been using. And actually the same also for the section. Let's put the section here first. And all right. So that's it for the visual styles. Right. And so now we're actually ready to build that layout itself. So let's analyze our original layout so that we can think a little bit how we will do this. So this layout here is very clearly a two-dimensional layout, right? And so therefore, of course, we're going to use CSS Grid to build it. Now, how many columns and rows do we need? Well, let's easily count them. So one column right here, then next one here, the inbox, another column, the email view, another column, and this one here, yet another column. So that looks like 4 columns. And then as for the rows, we have this one and this one. So just 2 rows. Now let's just see what happens when we make this smaller. So you see that this column and this column stays the same, and this one in the middle basically occupies the remaining space here. Right? And so with this, I think we have enough information to build our layout with CSS Grid. And which is actually the parent element of all of this. So all of these, or in other words, what do we want to be our grid container? Well, we can simply use the body, right? That's not a problem at all. So display grid, and now grid template columns, and that first column, so that navigation bar basically, let's make it 80 pixels. Then that inbox is the second column. I will make that 400 pixels. And as always, these values are kind of random. Then the third column, remember, is the main view, so the email view, and this one is supposed to occupy all the remaining space. And that means when it comes to CSS Grid, that it should be 1 FR, right? And then finally, the fourth column, which is the additional info, has also a fixed width. And so let's choose 250 for that. All right. And now the grid template rows, which sometimes we do actually not define, remember. But in this case, since we want to fill the entire screen, we will basically do it here automatically in the rows. So the first one is fixed. Again, 80 pixels for that menu bar. And then here the second row, we want it to go all the way to the end. Or in other words, we want it to occupy all the remaining space. All right. However, this is not yet going to work as we expect. So let's see that. And well, first of all, of course, these elements are not yet in the right position, but also the second row is actually not going all the way to the end here, right? Now, why do you think that is? And let's actually inspect this, because we will be able to find the answer there. So here we have the body element, and you see that it does indeed end right here after this element. So the height of the body is in fact only 136 pixels. So just like any other element, the body element does not magically occupy this entire space here. Alright, it only occupies, well, the place that it needs for its content. And so that's only until here. So what if we want actually for this row here to go all the way to the end? In that case, we need the body to be as high as the viewport, right? Well, luckily for us, we already learned how to do that, right? So the solution is to set the height to 100 viewport height units. Okay, and there we go. So now it occupies the entire space, and we see that our body is now 503 pixels high. And of course, if we make it higher and lower, then this value changes. Okay, but now let's actually place all these 5 items in the correct position. So first, this navigation here, it goes all the way from the first row to the end of the second row. So it spans across all of this. Then also the menu spans across this column and this one, right? So the grid lines here are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But, well, why not actually show it to you? So, yeah, this is the one. So here we see the grid lines, right? And so this one here will go from 2 all the way to the end, right? So let's do that. So we want to span across multiple rows here in the nav, right? And so we say grid row from the first all the way to the end. And let's actually not specify that manually, but instead we can do it automatically with -1. Remember that? And so if for some reason we were to add another row, then this navigation would still go all the way until the end. All right. Then we have the menu here, which we want to span across multiple columns. And so we use grid column. So this starts in the second and again goes all the way to the end. And so this is where our -1 trick gets really handy. Okay, and then the other ones should be automatically placed. And indeed they are. Great, so let's see what happens if we make our viewport smaller. And then that's exactly as expected. Beautiful. Now let's just style this here a little bit nicer. So the color might be white. Then let's also center the text in all of the elements. And for that, we can actually set it in the body because text align does actually get inherited. And let's also make the font weight bold, which again will get inherited. And so usually we don't put these things on the body, but since we have such an easy page and such an easy layout, well, we can simply put it here and then it will get inherited. Now let's just add some padding here to all of these elements. So the nav, menu, section, main, and aside. So basically all of them. Let's give them some padding at the top of 24 pixels, but this is really just a small cosmetic change. All right, beautiful. So we already did our layout, so that's pretty nice already. So this looks already almost the same, but now we're just missing 2 things. So 2 a little bit more detailed things, which is this menu bar with these buttons and then also this kind of inbox view here, right? And so let's do these two things in the next and final lecture of the section. All right, so let's now finish up our web app layout. And let's start by marking up these 5 buttons here. So here we have another background color. So let's immediately grab that here from the violet colors. So this one is a bit darker. Let's go actually with the darkest one here. Okay. And so right here inside of the menu, I will now replace this with some button elements. So new, reply, forward, mark as unread, and finally a trash button. Nice. So let's put him here. Give them some nice font size. And of course that background color that we just copied. Remember, on the button, we always need to remove the border. And we also always need to set a cursor to pointer. So VS Code actually already has this abbreviation here, because that is something that we do all the time. Then also on buttons, the color does for some reason not get inherited. So we need to set that manually, even though in the menu it is already white. So we can actually remove that from here. And to make them bigger, of course, let's give them some padding. So 8 pixels and 12 pixels. So let's take a look. And here they are. And they are centered because these are like text elements, so inline elements, and therefore they are treated like text. And since we have text align set to center everywhere, this also gets then centered inside of this container. All right. So let's just make them actually inline blocks and make the text bold also. Font weight bold. And I like to use the display property first for some reason, but you don't have to. Inline block. Okay. And now let's actually use flexbox here. So in order to give them some space between them, and then because I'm actually going to use this example to show you yet another really cool flexbox trick. So the parent element of these buttons is this menu. And so display set to flex. All right. Let's just check that out. All right. Nice. So we have our buttons here, and we probably need to get rid of this padding here in the top. And then we also want to vertically align this, of course. So that padding is here. So let's remove that menu simply. And then align items, center, and gap 12 pixels. Okay. Nice. Let's just add also some padding then to the section here on the left and right side. And then I finally want to show you something. So that's right here. So no padding top and bottom, and 40 pixels left and right. Okay. And now let's actually select the very last button to give it that red color. So since these buttons here are all button elements inside of one parent container, we can use our last child pseudo class, right? So button, and then a different background color. I'm just using red for now, but the actual color, well, that doesn't really work. Let's fix that in a second. Here I'm just going to get some nice pink color here, which matches beautifully with this one here. Oh, of course, here I actually forgot to write it. So last child, and then that color. Okay. So that's red, and now it looks almost the same, but the difference is that this very last element was moved all the way to the right side. So how can we do that? I mean, there's not really a property that we can use on a container to achieve this. The closest we could get, but that's still far away, would be justify content space between. So something like this. So now we at least have the trash in the very end, but then the spacing between here is completely messed up. So that's not what we want, but instead we want this one to move all the way to the right side. So now here comes the trick I was mentioning. And that trick is to set the margin here on this element, so the left margin, to auto. So then that margin here will automatically be calculated based, well, on the width of the container. So of course, if we then change this, then the margin here on the left side will change. Okay, and it would also work by setting a margin right on this one. But since we already have this one selected, I'm going to use margin left here. Okay, so let's remove this one here. And so, margin left set to auto. And there we go. You see? We can actually see that. So you see that it has a margin of 66.69 pixels, which is exactly the margin that is necessary to put that element there. And of course, if we change this, then the margin will be smaller. Well, it looks like it's not somehow. Let's just make it really small. Well, that looks strange. Actually, this is the margin, 248 pixels. And you see that now it is getting bigger, and it is actually 863. So actually 66 was not enough at all. So that 66.69 is actually just the width of the element. The margin is what we can see down here in the actual box model diagram. Okay, but anyway, that works nicely, and this is a trick that many people don't know, and it is a very important one that I actually use all the time. Okay, but now about this part here, and this is also easier than it looks, so let's quickly add 10 new boxes here, one for each email. Okay. And here I'm calling them email with a class. So email 1, and now I'll just copy it 10 times. Just copy it like this, and then Prettier will actually make it nice for us. 9 and 10. Okay, so let's style them. Okay, so email. And let's again get some gray background color here. Let's use this one, which is quite darker than the other one. So the background color. And let's get actually this here also some padding of also 40 pixels so that it's aligned with the buttons in the menu bar. And let's give each of them some height. So 96 pixels. And that should already look quite good. So here we are. And now, of course, our layout did grow vertically in order to make space for all of these elements here. So by default, of course, they do not show this behavior with the scroll bar, but instead they take up all of the space, and therefore this second row of the grid then needs to grow in order to accommodate for that space. Now let's also actually create some spacing between these elements. And for that, I want to use the gap property. Remember how we can do that vertically. So of course, remember that by default, the gap property applies horizontally like here, right? But if we want to use it vertically, then we can still use flexbox. All we have to do is to change the flex direction from row to column. So we did that before in this section, I think even twice. And so if you don't remember that, I even did a very nice visual representation of that change. And so maybe you can find that in one of the first lectures in this section. But anyway, the flex container of these email items here is of course the section. And so let's make this the flex container. And then we want the gap property of 40 pixels. And just as a review, let's see what happens if we do not specify flex direction. So then of course they are side by side like this, and with the gap applied horizontally. And so now, as I was saying, what we need to do is to change this to column. And nice, that looks nice. Let's just center the text here also inside of each email, because with that we can practice some more flexbox. And remember that this works basically because flexbox treats texts as a flex item. Okay, and so we can use align items center and justify content center. So this we have done many times, so hopefully these 3 lines of flexbox are already nicely inside of your brain. All right, and so now it is time for the trick where we want this element here to not grow larger than the content. All right, so by default, of course, this element here, so this container element, had simply the size of this grid row. But then we put all of these elements into it, and so then it grew bigger to accommodate for all that content. But we can make it so that it does not grow. So that's right here. It's the section element. And so we can say overflow and then set to scroll. Okay, now this alone will not fix it, because since this is now a flex container, what this will do instead of giving us the scroll bar is to basically shrink these flex items, because by default flex shrink is set to 1. So again, by default, flex items are allowed to shrink if necessary, right? But we can turn that off by going to all of these flex items and then in there set flex shrink to 0. But this one is of course only necessary because we are using flexbox. If we were not using flexbox, then this one here would be enough. Okay, so just keep that in mind. This property has nothing to do with flexbox. All right, this has been in CSS for a long time. Okay, and so now we are back to, if I'm scrolling here, nothing happens, because now this grid row here is back to just being 1FR. So basically only occupying this space here. And then here we made it so that any content that overflowed would get some scroll bar. Okay, now here instead of scroll, one of the other things we use all the time is hidden. And so in this case, then the content that was overflown, so that did overflow and did no longer fit here, simply disappears. So now I'm scrolling here, but, well, these other items are simply hidden. Okay, but in this case, that's not what we want. Sometimes it is, but in this case, we want scroll. Let me actually write that here. So how elements that don't fit into container appear. Okay, now we're back to scrolling. And so now our nice little layout here is finished. And it looks quite nice. So I'm really happy with this result, and I hope that you are too. All right, and so right now at this point, we studied so much HTML and so much CSS, things like Flexbox and CSS Grid, but of course also all the other CSS properties, that we are now ready to start working on our big and final project of this course. Just make sure before you move there that you did actually understand everything that we did here, because we will use most of the things, or maybe even all of the things that we learned until now in this big project. But then once you're done reviewing everything, I can't wait to show you that project in the next section.